ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात् ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः Namaste my dear friends. I am going to start Bhagwan Sri Ramana Maharshi's teachings through Sri Ramana Gita. This is the first video on Ramana Gita. Let us discuss how this Ramana Gita came into existence. In 1903, there came to Tiruvannamalai the great Sanskrit scholar, poet and yogi Ganpati Sastri, known also as Ganpati Muni, because of the austerities he had been observing. He had the title Kavya Kantha, one who had poetry at his throat, and his disciples addressed him as Nena, father. He visited Ramana in the Virupaksha cave quite a few times. Once in 1907, he was assailed by doubts regarding his own spiritual practices. He went up the hill, saw Ramana sitting alone in the cave, and expressed himself thus: all that has to be read, I have read. Even Vedanta Shastra I have fully understood. I have done japa to my heart's content, yet I have not up to this time understood what tapas is. Therefore I have sought refuge at your feet. Pray enlighten me as to the nature of tapas. Ramana replied, now speaking, if one watches whence the notion I arises, the mind gets observed there, that is tapas. When a mantra is repeated, if one watches whence that mantra sound arises, the mind gets absorbed there, that is tapas. To the scholar, this came as a revelation. He felt the grace of the sage enveloping him. He it was that proclaimed Ramana to be Maharshi and Bhagwan. He composed hymns in Sanskrit in praise of the sage, and later composed the Ramana Gita explaining his teachings. Ganpati had a large band of disciples, and they all gathered at Sakandasram to ask the Maharshi to clarify knotty questions. The Muni agreed to cast the answers in verse form as a Gita in Sanskrit in the traditional 18 chapters. The work was fully completed by 917, and the Maharshi approved the work. The Ramana Gita, extract from Bhagwan and Nena by S. Shankara Narayanan. This is the biography of Ganpati Muni. This is one of the important works on Maharshi's teachings by his illustrious disciple Vasishtha Ganpati Muni. It records the instruction of Maharshi on various themes of spiritual importance and mode of sadhana in answer to serious queries addressed to him by sincere devotees and aspirants. Most of the queries belong to the period of 1916 and 1917 when Bhagwan was least communicative. It is to the credit of the questioners that by their seriousness of purpose and sincerity of aspiration, they could draw the Maharshi out, and it was most fortunate that Vasishtha Muni was present on those occasions, himself at times being a questioner to give an authentic and authoritative record of the whole proceedings. The work consists of 300 verses in mellifluous Sanskrit and is divided into 18 chapters. The meter employed is mainly Anustab, though in the 18th chapter Dhruta Vilambitam, Vasanta Tilka, Rathodhata and Swagata are employed. The work is fashioned on the lines of Bhagavad Gita and bears the name of Gita. It is also divided into 18 chapters. A question may arise here that the appellation Gita belongs only to Bhagavad Gita and it would not be proper to call any other teaching as Gita. But there have been precedents where teachings of spiritual import have been called Gita. Thus we have Rama Gita, Hanuman Gita, Ganesha Gita, Ribhu Gita, etc. The story of Dharma Vyadha in Mahabharata is known as Vyadha Gita, as Maharshi's teachings are of great spiritual import and authoritative because of authentic experience. The work is called Gita. It is called Ramana Gita because the teacher is Maharshi Ramana and whatever Maharshi imparts, it is based on his own experience and inner vision and not based on the scrutiny of Shastras, either past or present. This does not mean that Maharshi's teachings are not according to Shastras. Any discerning reader would find that whatever Maharshi says not only accords with the Shastras but throws light on many points in the Shastras hitherto obscure and unexplained. One thing has to be remembered that Maharshi's teaching does not demand as a prerequisite any knowledge of the Shastras or any religious teaching. Its concern is mainly with man and his essential problem. Though questions might have been asked by each one from different viewpoints, the answers from the Maharshi always emanate from the standpoint of the self. As self is the common denomination to all people in all walks of life, the teaching is relevant to all without any distinction and is the need of the hour. The primary purpose of the teaching is self-inquiry and taking one's stand in the self. It is traditionally explained that man has got four purposes in life which are known as Purusharthas. These are Dharma, righteous conduct, Artha, the meaning and purpose of things, Kama, desire, and Moksha, liberation. These, the last one is said to be the supreme purpose of life. Brahma Purushartha. According to Maharshi, there is only one purpose in life for man, that is to seek the self and remain in it all the time. Dharma is that which holds dharnat dharmaha, and righteous conduct is the one that holds the society together. But in truth, that which holds everything intact is the self. Artha is the meaning and purpose. Only because of self everything has a meaning. Kama is desire and the thing that taper the thing that a person desires most is himself, which is the self within him. Moksha liberation is the state when the self sparkles all the time as the real I. Thus, behind the four purposes of life exists only one real purpose, that is seeking the self. It is not the purpose of this teaching to enunciate a new doctrine, to find a new religion or creed. Maharshi is gracious enough to share his experience with the inquirer. As his approach is so radical, you are shaken to the foundations, all your pet theories get demolished. But like some other masters, he does not leave you severely alone after that. He gives his gracious guidance to build on the ruins, and he leads you on towards finding the self. The questions taken up for consideration by the Maharshi are often intricate, relating as they do to the deepest experiences in yoga and involve very subtle perception and analysis. But fortunately, Ramana Gita has been commented upon by the scholar Yogi Sri Kapali Shastriyar, the illustrious disciple of Vasishtha Ganpati Muni, and his commentary Prakasa in simple and lucid Sanskrit throws a flood of light on all abstruse points and is a great help for the proper understanding of the high philosophical concepts and deep spiritual imports embodied in the teaching of the Maharishi. The text deals with the 37 questions by various aspirants, including the Muni, and extensive and clear-cut answers to them by the Maharishi. Each chapter deals with a theme, tells the occasion, the exact date according to the Christian era, in most cases gives the background and details of discussion. But all chapters do not deal with questions and answers. The second chapter, which is like a crushed jewel in the whole composition, narrates an incident in 1915 when the Maharshi gave out the essence of his teaching by means of the famous verse Hridaya Kuhara Madhe. An exposition of this verse form the theme of the second chapter. Similarly, the fifth and sixth chapters do not contain any questions. Maharshi, out of his own volition, without anybody asking him any questions, imparted to all those present around him the secrets of Hridaya Vidya and the various methods of controlling the mind. These are recorded in all detail in the fifth and sixth chapters. Let us now enumerate the topics discussed in other chapters. Chapter 1, the importance of self-abidance. In the first chapter are discussed the importance of spiritual practice, the supreme state, which is the real form of the self, and what happens when the practice is started with a desire to achieve something. Chapter 2, The Three Paths. Chapter 3, The Paramount Duty Task. In the third chapter is mentioned the most important thing to be done by man in this life, which is the realization of one's self and the role of japa of mantras like Parnava to achieve it. Chapter 4, Nature of Knowledge. The fourth chapter deals with the great secret of knowledge and the poise of all. The fourth chapter deals with the great secret of knowledge and the poise of all activities in the self. Chapter 5, The Science of the Heart. Chapter 6, Mind Control. Chapter 7, Self Inquiry, Competence and Components. Chapter 8, On Asramas. The seventh and eighth chapters deal extensively with the nature of self-inquiry, with the fitness of persons for this, the purpose of religious rituals and rites, and the purpose of the four asramas, stages of life. Here it is unequivocally declared that deliberation on oneself is the highest merit to be obtained. The sacred of the most sacred things, Swabhimarshaha Param Punyam Pavannam Hi Pavanam. Chapter 9, On Cutting the Knot. Granthi Bheda. The breaking of the knot in the heart by self-inquiry is discussed in the ninth chapter. Chapter 10, while the 10th discusses the place of man in society and advocates universal brotherhood for the welfare of mankind. Chapter 11, The secret harmony between knowledge and the siddhis one gets in sadhana is explained in the 11th chapter. Chapter 12, The 12th chapter deals with the questions put by Sri Kapali Shastriyar to the Maharshi and the Maharshi's subtle analysis of the relationship between Shakti and Sakta, the force and the possessor of force. Chapter 13, the 13th chapter entirely breaks new ground. Vasishtha Ganpati Muni's wife is the questioner here. The Maharshi declares that a woman has an equal right with man for sannyasa, and the body of a self-realized woman when she leaves the body has to be interred and not burnt. This becomes the authority later on to erect a samadhi over the corporeal remains of the Maharshi's mother, who got self-realization with the active help of Maharshi himself. Chapter 14. The 14th chapter gives an exposition on Jivan Mukti, liberation even when living in a body. Chapter 15. The 15th discusses about the true nature of three instruments of devotion: Sarvana, hearing; Manana, thinking; and Nididhyasana, desire to visualize in their role of seeking the self. Chapter 16. The next chapter deals with the true nature of bhakti, devotion. Chapter 17. The 17th chapter deals with the attainment of knowledge. Self-knowledge is not acquired daily, little by little. When practice attains maturity, self-knowledge flashes forth suddenly like the sun. Chapter 18. The 18th and last chapter contains 26 verses, out of which 24 verses are in praise of the Maharshi, describing his very human and divine qualities. These are exquisite pieces of Sanskrit poetry in beautiful meters of Dhruta Vilambitam, Vasant Tilka, and Rathodhata. The last two verses in Swagata meter comprise the question and answers on the Siddhas. Amongst the 24 verses of praise is the famous sloka Nilarvinda Suharda, which was later approved by the Maharshi as his own dhyana sloka and the enunciation of the mantra of Maharshi in the verse Veda Deepika Damanatra, which was later commented by Muni separately in his Guru Mantra Bhasha. Thus, the whole work harmonizes every spiritual endeavor and philosophical concept from the standpoint of the self and is an inspiring guide to all those who sincerely aspire for the higher values of life. 1. The entire universe is but a tiny ripple in that infinite ocean of Satchitananda. Sri Ramana, in my heart I dwell upon him who inheres therein the unfathomable Ramana who has transcended all realms of thought. Krishna Bhiksu translations on the importance of spiritual practice, composed by Ganpati Muni, translation by Sri Viswanatha Swami and Professor K. Swaminathan. Invocation. Second question. Is a study of scriptures enough by itself to liberate those desirous of knowledge, or is spiritual practice according to the Master's injunction also necessary? Answer. The seeker of knowledge does not achieve his end merely by a study of the scriptures. Without upasana, there cannot be attainment for him. This is definite. Experiencing the natural state during spiritual practice is called upasana, and when that state becomes firm and permanent, that itself is called jnana. Kapali Shastriyar translation. Verse 14. Abandoning the sensory objects, remaining in one's own nature in the form of a flame of knowledge is said to be the natural state of the self. Commentary. Bhagwan Maharshi lays down of his own accord the form of spiritual practice he intends. The knowers of the self speak of the natural poise that is accomplished without any effort in the course of sadhana as practiced by the strength of constant repetition. It becomes steadfast, firm, and ready at hand. What is this natural state? In verse 14, he explains spiritual practice. A.R. Natarajan translation. First question, verse 4. Will the discrimination between the real and the unreal itself be enough to liberate, or is there any other spiritual practice for it? Second question, verse 5. For the seekers of truth, is the critical study of the scriptures alone enough for liberation, or is spiritual practice in accordance with Guru's guidance also necessary? Commentary. Verse 4 and 5. In verse 4 and 5, Ganpati Muni refers to the two traditional methods for attaining liberation. These verses deal with the question of the best method for liberation. The freedom sought is from the cycle of karma, of birth following death and death following birth without a break. Actions, good and bad, have an ethical content producing results in time in accordance with the divine law. The effort of all spiritual seekers is to be free of this bondage to karma, to sorrow. The scriptures declare that Brahma alone is real, the fullness of consciousness. The body and the world are jada or insentient and therefore unreal. The traditional way to attain knowledge is to negate the world as unreal and affirm the reality of Brahma. Such practice, it is said, would lead to the firm conviction of the truth of the proposition and would result in self knowledge. When the phenomena are negated as unreal, what remains is real. It may be noted that this practice is different from discrimination between Nitya permanent and Anitya transient. Such discrimination would bring about dispassion for the world. It is also necessary to mention that the other limbs of spiritual practice for self knowledge are said to be the absence of desire for fruits of action on earth or in heaven, sustained urge for liberation, and the cultivation of six virtues, each of which has to be mastered before proceeding to the next, namely calmness, restraint of mind, control of senses, withdrawal, forbearance, faith, single mindedness. Vivek Chudamani verses 20, 21, 71. The doubt is whether this practice alone would suffice. This arises in the context of the scriptural emphasis on experience by direct perception of truth. Here it is necessary to make a reference to certain fundamental points made by Ramana on the question of liberation. He points out that liberation and the sense of doership are linked. As long as one considers that he is the doer, there is no escape from the fruits of action. He further points out that it is only who thinks he is bound who has to think in terms of the opposite freedom. So one should question, for whom is this bondage? For whom is the liberation? Such an inquiry would reveal the true nature of the individual to whom they relate. The method of self-inquiry taught by Ramana is dealt with chapter 7 Sat Darshanam verse 38. Talks with Ramana Maharshi, page 30, 357 358 AR Natarajan translation. Answer to first question. Verse 4 is seen in verse 10 and verse 11. Verse 10, self-abidance alone can release one from all bondage. However, the discrimination between the real and unreal leads to distaste for the transient. Verse 11, the profound Jnani is always rooted in the self alone. He does not think of the universe as unreal, nor does he see it as apart from himself. Commentary. The reply to the first question is categorical. It is only the fire of knowledge that can burn away karma and liberate. Such knowledge would be firm only if based on experience, based on self-abidance. Bondage is born of attachment to the pleasurable and dislike for the unpleasant. Discrimination produces a firm intellectual conviction of the lack of value of all things transient. It therefore ripens the mind for single-minded pursuit of the effort necessary for self-abidance. A clarification given by Ramana is worth noting. He says that an examination of the ephemeral nature of external phenomena leads to vairagya. Hence, this discrimination is the first step to be taken and will result in contempt for wealth, fame, ease, pleasure, etc. The eye thought becomes clearer for inspection. Talks with Ramana Maharshi, page 26. Though engaged in activity, he Jnani is not distracted from the self-consciousness within. His mind is never externalized. He is fearless. The world is unreal if seen only as form and name. The wise perceive both the differences, the names and forms, and the underlying unity. Since nothing is seen as apart from himself, the world too is seen as permeated by consciousness and cannot therefore be unreal. Ramana also states that while the existence of the world is accepted both by the wise and the ignorant, the difference lies in the fact that the ignorant foist an independent reality on the world while the wise are conscious only of the self, the real. Sat Darshanam, verse 18. A.R. Natarajan translation. Answer to question 2 is covered by verses 12, 13 and 14 commentary. The term Upasana or sitting near has been differently interpreted. According to some, it is the study in depth of the scriptures. Some others say that it is the spiritual practice in accordance to the Guru's guidance. Yet others say that it is the continuous repetition of the holy mantras. In line with the enquiry method taught by him, Ramana equates it with intermittent abidance in one's natural state during spiritual practice. The emphasis clearly shifts to practice and experience. When such abidance becomes steady, it is termed knowledge, jnana. The means and the end are not different. Implicit in the reply is the idea that knowledge and ignorance can alternate till knowledge becomes steady. That is, when abidance is unshaken by sense attractions. An alternative translation, Ramana Gita, English translation and commentary by A.R. Natarajan, 5th edition. It is said that in the days of yore, Shiva as Dakshinamurti, the great god, chose to teach a handful of disciples, just four of them, the way to self-knowledge. The Chandogya Upanishad talks of the Sanat Kumara regarded as the foremost of the knowers of the self, teaching just one hungry seeker, the sage Narada. For what matters is earnestness, a total involvement, an exclusive concern to find out the truth. In this century, such a blessing fell on a small band of persons to whom it was given to learn the science of the heart from Ramana Maharshi. The setting was the Virupaksha cave and Sakandasramam on the holy Arunachala hill in the years 1913 to 1917. The questioners were Ganpati Muni, Devarta, Karshani, Yoganatha, Kapali, Vilakshi, Vedarbha, and Amritanatha. just 8 of them, but they have placed generations of spiritual seekers in their depth by covering the whole gamut of what matters for those concerned with self knowledge. Ganapati Muni, the divinely inspired composer, was the son of Narsimha Sastri. He was born on 17th November 1878 in Kalurai in Andhra Pradesh. At a young age, he had mastered the scriptures, meditated on the meaning of many sacred mantras, and observed hundreds of austerities. Yet, peace was denied to him till he surrendered to Ramana and learned directly from him the truth about tapas, about penance. Ramana himself has made it clear that the composition is authentic and that it records accurately the conversations. Once he remarked, remembering such talks was child's play for him. He could listen to long and intricate lecture and produce the gist of it accurately in the form of sutras, not introduction, omitting anything of importance which had been stated. So remarkable was his power of memory. He must have reproduced Ramana Gita in that way. There have been 6 English translations of the Ramana Gita from 1935 to 1977, but the only commentary was by Kapali Shastriyar in Sanskrit in 1941. This book is the first English commentary on the Ramana Gita, a rare blessing indeed to be given this opportunity. How can one repay the debt to the Maharishi? A picture of Ganpati Muni from this book by A.R. Natarajan can be seen in the photos file. Krishna Bhiksu's translation. This Ramana Gita is the purer Ganges. It arises from the greater Lord of the Hills, Sri Sir Ramana Muni, the poet Ganpati, cleansing at every step the worst errors and reaches the sea, the devotee's heart. Here begins the Ramana Gita composed by Ganpati Muni, translation by Sri Vishwanatha Swami and Professor K. Swaminathan, and flows out the path being the wise. Chapter 1, the importance of self-abidance. 1. I bow to Maharshi Ramana, Kartikeya, son of Shiva in human form, and set forth his teaching in this lucid work. 2 and 3. In the year 1913, Common Era, the 29th of a cold December night, when all devotees were seated round with attentive minds, I asked Bhagwan Maharshi for definite answers to certain questions. Note: Kartikeya is Skanda, a son of Lord Shiva. Ganpati Muni, drawing on the Puranas, saw Ramana as an embodiment of Skanda come to slay the demon ego Tarka. A.R. Natarajan translation commentary. Ganpati Muni describes Ramana as the human embodiment of the divinity Kartikeya, the preeminent teacher of the self. This reference is based on the repeated visions the Muni had. The Muni later extols Ramana's divinity in chapters 11 and 18. Kartikeya is referred to as Sanat Kumara in Chandogya Upanishad and as teacher of Brahma Vidya to the great sage Narada. Ramana is cast in the same role as his divine purpose was visualized by the Muni to be the same. Verse 9. Hearing these questions of mine, Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi, to dispel my doubts, and in the plenitude of his grace spoke thus. First question, verse 4. Is mukti to be had by mere discrimination between the real and the unreal, or are there other means for the ending of bondage? Answer, verse 10. Abidance in the self alone releases one from all bonds. Discrimination between the real and the unreal leads to non attachment. Note, in the original text, the questions are grouped together, and so are the answers to make it easier to follow. Here, the questions and answers are juxtaposed and placed together. To be continued with the second question. Question 3. Ganpati Muni asks Sri Bhagwan Kapali Shastriyar translation. Does one established in consciousness conclude that he is established in consciousness, knowing the fullness of things, or the seizing of knowledge? Krishna Bhiksu translation. How does one abiding in the cognizant self recognize himself as such? Is it by knowing the fullness of his enlightenment, or is it by his indifference towards sense objects? Ramana answers. Kapali Shastriya translation. 15. When the natural state becomes fixed by a silence devoid of impressions, the jnani would be without a doubt able to conclude that he is a jnani himself. 15. In the firm, natural, innate state, the self, in that supreme silence where there is no urge to respond to any impulse, by that very sign, the enlightened know without any doubt that they are enlightened. Further to the previous correction, both Kapali and Krishna gave the answers to question 3 as verse 6 only. The answer to 4 they gave as 16 only. Kapali only the first half. To question 5, Kapali gives the second part of 16 and ends the whole chapter on 17. To question 5, Krishna gives 16, second half of 16 and 17 as answer to question 6. So it looks like our three translators are perhaps working from different versions of the original text. Perhaps the Muni made revisions, or there are printer's errors. Perhaps we each better be faithful to our own printed text in English, regardless of what differences may appear, and let the reader get the gist. What do you think? Question 3. A.R. Natarajan translation. Verse 6. How does a person of steady knowledge know that he is one such? Is it because of the awareness of the fullness of his knowledge, or is it because of cessation of objective awareness? Verse 7. By what hallmark do the learned recognize the knower? Note, this is later referred to as the fourth question with answer in verse 16. Commentary. The expression Sthit Prajna means one who is rooted in self-knowledge. The wisdom of such a person is steady and firm. For such a person there are no others. Perception of oneness does not mean that such a person is not aware of objects. It only means that self attention is not lost because of objective awareness. The Muni puts the questions from two angles, from the viewpoint of the knower himself and that of the onlooker. Something should stand out in a person to enable his or her identification straightway as a wise person. Note: Natarajan's use of the word objective should not be confused with its use as in opposite of subjective. Answer verse 15. In the firm natural state, through the silence of the mind, free of all tendencies, the knower knows himself as such without any doubt. Commentary. This is Ramana's answer to the third question. The expression mauna means silence. It may be wrongly taken to mean refraining from speech. What is the good of keeping the mouth closed and letting the mind run riot? Ramana would ask, nor could it refer to forced stillness brought about by breath control and certain other spiritual practices. The silence referred to in this verse is the natural quietness of the mind, a mind which does not become externalized by contact with sense objects because tendencies have been destroyed. The flame of knowledge burns away the seeds of the latent tendencies which pull out the mind. The certainty of the knower springs from the firmness of his experience. Such silence is potent and knowledge is best communicated by the truly silent ones. Dakshinamurti Shiva of yore and Ramana of present exemplify this. The third question of Ganpati Mani to Bhagwan Sri Ramana Maharshi Krishna Bhiksu translation verse 12 and 13. When one is fit for self-inquiry by his non-attachment for sense objects and by discrimination are ceremonial baths, sandhya, repetition of mantras, oblations poured into the fire, chanting of Vedas, worship of gods, bhajan, pilgrimage, sacrifice, giving in charity, and observance of special spiritual practices. Are these of any use or are they a waste of time? Answer. Verse 14. For competent beginners with waning attachments, all these aids will make the mind increasingly pure. Verse 15. Virtuous activity of mind, speech, and body destroys the contrary activity of mind, speech, and body. Verse 16. All this virtuous activity of competent persons, mature and endowed with minds of highest purity, benefits the world. Men of mature wisdom perform action for teaching, for example, and for the welfare of others, not out of fear of violating scriptural injunctions. Virtuous actions performed without a sense of difference and without attachment do not stand, O best of men, in the way of self-enquiry. The non-performance of prescribed actions by a mature person pursuing self-enquiry is no sin, for self-enquiry is itself the most meritorious and most purifying of action. Two ways of life. Verse 20. Two ways of life are seen in the mature among competent seekers: renunciation of action for solitary communion and action for the good of others. Question 4. Ganpati Muni asks Sri Bhagwan, translation Sri Vishwanatha Swami and Professor K. Swaminathan. By what indications are the learned able to recognize the Jnani? Answer. 16. First up, from the mark of equality towards all beings, one's attainment of jnana is inferred. Kapali Sastriyar Translation Commentary. He sees all beings as equal to the self, to have in them an equality of vision without any differentiation. This is not an outward mark, but palpable to the inner eye and recognized by mature minds, by those whose minds are turned inwards. This is an extract from the commentary now published by Ramana, slightly paraphrased. Kapali's commentary has only recently been translated into English by S. Narayanan. The commentary was written at the same time as the Muni composed the Gita, shown to Bhagwan and approved by him. A report of this event is in Kapali's diary appended to the commentary. A.R. Natarajan Translation Question 4 Verse 7. By what hallmark do the learned recognize the knower? Answer. Verse 16. Let one know that he is knower by his hallmark of equality for all creation. Commentary. This is the answer to the fourth question. The wise are indrawn, self-rooted, so there may not be any externalization of the great state. How the how the sun to find out there is a knower or not. Their state is apprehended by others by the unitary vision of the person. In the vision of the wise, everything is perceived only as the self. The absence of others makes for a natural and universal law in which the question of preference does not arise. His equal treatment of all creation would stand out. Ramana has clarified to Kapali Shastri what exactly the equality of a jnani, a wise one, means. The very term equality implies the existence of differences. It is a unity which the wise one perceives in all differences, which I call equality. Equality does not mean ignorance of distinction. When you have realization, you can see that these differences are formal. They are not substantial or permanent, and what is essential in all these appearances is the one truth, the reality. Question 5. Ganapati Muni asks Sri Bhagwan. Krishna Bhiksu Translation 7. Second half. Does Samadhi lead only to enlightenment, or does it confer the fruit desired? 16. Second half. Answer. Though practice is begun with desire, when Samadhi ensures, surely the desire will be attained. A.R. Natarajan Translation. Question 5 verse 7a. Does Samadhi, the conscious absorption of the mind in the heart, result only in knowledge, or does it also fulfill desires? Commentary. The scriptures have described different kinds of samadhi. Merging in reality and remaining unaware of the world is nirvikalpa samadhi. Remaining in this primal, pure, natural state without effort is sahaja samadhi. In this state, activity and objective awareness do not distract one from self-rootedness. The doubt is about what happens to the pre-existing desire. Answer to question 5 verse 17. Even though the practice of absorption of the mind in the heart is begun for fulfilling a desire, that desire also will certainly fructify. Note commentary. The commentary answers 5 and 6 to follow verse 18. Question 6. Krishna Bhiksu translation. 8. The Muni. If one comes to abide in the cognizant self-practicing yoga for a desired end, is the fruit of that desire obtained or not? 17. Bhagwan. In practicing yoga with a desire, if one comes to abide in the cognizant self, though the desire fructifies, it will not lead to any exuberant joy. So here the chapter 1 is completed. So I also conclude this video number 1 at this stage. Next video 2 on Ramana Gita will start with A.R. Natarajan translation question 6. Thank you for watching this video. Namaskar, my dear friend. Thank you.